I'm binge watching it.
It was really crazy.
I'm rewatching the hate series. What's your favorite show?
All right, I can honestly say I have no idea what we're going to talk about with Slaughterhouse 5 because it tends to go all over the place with any class, which is perfectly fine. We do have the note. I have the note sheet up on like the next slide, so we can certainly go over stuff that's in there. But a couple things from over the years that that have been constant comments or ideas. Is I think you got a lot of folks who aren't sure what to make of this. Should it be silly or is it meant to be, serious? What's the overall point? Where is this thing going? And if there's a phrase that has been a lightning rod over the years, it has been "so it goes," because folks will. That doesn't even look like goes. Pretend it is. People will embrace that phrase and go, this is the best thing ever. Or you have other folks who are upset that you will have a death of an innocent victim in the bombing of Dresden paralleled with a flat bottle of champagne or, a shirt that's being deloused and the insects have died, so it goes. So those kind of tend to be, big comments that come up. Or concerns, which we can address those or anything else. Folks will also go like, is this real? Is he really time traveling, or is it all in his head? That's debatable, or at least is it meant to be portrayed that Vonnegut would say, Schraubenzorgans are real, he's really bouncing all over the place, or it's solely within his head. And that's something where it kind of tends to be a 50-50 proposition. I don't think it really matters if it's real, meant to be real, or not real. To Billy, it's real, and so that would at least be, kind of the significant part. But any reactions to any of those things up there? Did you figure out the point? Are you still trying to figure out what in the world's going on? Is this real literature, or is this just a random bunch of stuff with a hardcover that we pretend is a book, but really not a book?
I don't know. People say it's an anti-war novel, but I didn't get that. And if it was, it's different than all the other anti-war novels.
And I'm not trying to make this, okay, we're doing the serious, silly conversation, but an anti-war book usually is something that kind of falls into that this is serious, heavy stuff. It's not All Quiet on the Western Front, by any means. If anyone read A Farewell to Arms, it's certainly, not that. I think one of the things that surprises people is it's supposedly, at least put it this way, supposedly a book about Dresden. Dresden hasn't really shown up all that much through the first half of the book. If you've read beyond the first half of the book, there hasn't been the secret Dresden chapter later on. It's never really a main focal point of what's going on. So I think part of the reason why that anti-war label gets put on it is that chapter 1, Vonnegut's very outspoken, direct about it. I've been trying to write a war novel for 23 years to deal with this. This is the best that I was able to do. Mentions that it's a failure, so you could go, hey, it's not a very good anti-war book since he's said that. And when it's getting published, you have Vietnam War raging on pretty much at its height. So you have a crowd, an audience looking for an anti-war, anti-establishment book, and that could be part of the reason why you kind of latch onto this one. But so far as war is terrible, we need to change everything, you don't get maybe that direct statement the way that you would expect it to. And some people, I think, become uncomfortable where they'll read some parts that are kind of silly or slapstick or dark humor, comedic jokes, where you shouldn't be laughing about a book that's going to be having people dying by hundreds of thousands. And there's pictures, which Emma found.
Mostly about like science.
Well, they're all over, and there'll be some other ones later on, that won't be Graveson's. Poem. Any other general feedback, comments, or jump into a note sheet?
I think the point to it is kind of like, this
basically what it says chapter on. This is my attempt of trying to write about this very traumatic moment in my life the best way I can, and the best way I can is through utter complete nonsense. So basically I'm gonna talk about Dresden, I'm gonna talk about it my way, and yeah, here it is.
The book itself is definitely a coping mechanism.
In your face.
The phrase "so it goes" ends up being a coping mechanism as well for some. If you fail your physics test, some will go "so it goes" and it'll be okay. Others will go, "No, that's not enough. It's not going. It's stopped. I need to do better." Or I can't ignore a simple moment with it. So the book as a whole for Vonnegut, yeah, I'd say coping mechanism. The phrase can be that for some. It's going to be the total opposite for others. There's certainly, throughout a juxtaposition of lots of ideas. So it goes in itself kind of causes juxtaposition. Usually you're dealing with some kind of heavy, significant, poignant moment where there is going to be a death that takes place. You have the death, so it goes. Then you kind of jump ship and you go to some other completely total direction with it. And maybe you're in outer space, maybe you're 10 years before, maybe you're 10 years later. You have a juxtaposition of serious content, silly sarcasm, and you even have, I would say, a juxtaposition of characters where when we read something like Catcher in the Rye, people would go, Salinger and Holden are very much like the same voice, same person. One thing that I would strongly urge you to keep in mind is that Vonnegut does not, Vonnegut does not equal Billy. They are definitely not the same person. So just because Billy might embrace So It Goes doesn't necessarily mean that Vonnegut's going to do the same way. You can certainly tell that you have separate people when it comes to the first-person narration. You have first person in chapter 1 where it's him kind of describing what's going on. Then it shifts over to pretty much a third-person narration. This is what happened to Billy. Billy says this. Elliot Rosenborn does that. But every now and then you'll get a shift where I comes back. And I being the author. So when Billy's on the train, you have your author coming back and I was there. I was on the train car. Or when he's at the latrine, around like 125 or so, the I comes back. So you do have a definite delineation between Vonnegut, the KV voice, and Billy are not meant to be the same thing. So just because So It Goes shows up in the book doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be Vonnegut's whole aphorism that he wants you to keep in mind for every single event that takes place.
I don't know if he even did it intentionally, but like with this book being all over the place, this could be like a way to show how insane war can be and how it can mess with your mind, I guess.
Well, so your first part, I don't know if he meant it to be, disjointed or whatnot. I would say he definitely did.
Yeah.
And we took a look, you remember, at the title page when we first passed it out. It doesn't mean a whole lot because we don't know who Tralfamadorians are and all that kind of stuff. But Slaughterhouse 5 or The Children's Crusade, which he made the promise to Mary O'Hare that, if I write this book, I'll call it The Children's Crusade. There it is. By Kurt Vonnegut. And you scroll down, this is a novel somewhat in the telegraphic, schizophrenic manner of Tales of the Planet Tralfamador, where the flying saucers come from, peace. You get the whole description. I think on the back of your note sheet is where I mentioned it here from page 88, I believe, where you do get a little bit of a description of what Tralfamadorian books would be like. Anyone remember the...
They kind of look like telegrams. Not necessarily telegrams.
Yeah, he compares them to telegrams.
Yeah.
So yeah, you got all these symbols.
It's like the little sections, and then you're meant to look at them all at once, and they're all not connected, but you're meant to like somehow see what the author wanted you to see with all of them together.
And I almost, some of us are visual, some of us are going to be more auditory, but almost sound like a collage, where if you were to go to a museum where you see like a series of photos or paintings. It's not that necessarily each one has to be beautiful, but you look at them together, and that's where you get more of like an emotional reaction kind of coming from. Well, with the way the book is set up, with the fact that you have all these like kind of isolated chunks of the story bouncing back and forth here to here, if you look at each one of those things individually, no, there's maybe not much of a reaction. But if you take a look at the book as a whole, that's where you kind of do start to get, I don't necessarily want to say significance, where you're going to go, oh, the book is beautiful, but you get maybe a little bit more meaning coming from it if you look at that whole entire series of it. Certainly, and this is where, you know, you kind of start to do the what if game. We're trying to figure out what's really going on in Billy's head. When does Billy, or who introduces Billy to science fiction? One of the names, not the author, but Elliot shows him, you know, Kilgore Trout. He'd be really good if he could only write.
Billy?
Kilgore Trout's science fiction writer. He starts to embrace all these science fiction books when he is in the VA hospital right after the war, when basically he would be suffering probably from something along the lines of PTSD. So the time travel aspect, there's a very easy argument that you could make that, yeah, it's all certainly part of his head and part of what happened from the war that's kind of caused him to do this. Do you want to relive all these moments all over again? No. So a nice coping mechanism maybe is to get out of here. I'm going to go 440 quadrillion miles away to Tralfamadore and be in my biodome, you know, and survive in the zoo. I need a bag.
So in Tralfamadore, you said it was like 6 months you've been there, and like no time passed. That's what happened.
Yep, and because, you know, Barbara, obviously, your nuts dad.
Yeah.
Oh, I could be away from, and it's just like a millisecond, you know, away. And again, like with space and all that kind of stuff, you know, people talk about if we do send Kobe off to Mars, you know, how's his body going to do in the super light speed, you know, spaceship that we're going to send him to? Are you going to come back aged then, or are you going to come back and
burned to a
I
crisp?
have no idea what's going to happen. But yeah, it would be part of that. He's away, but we would never know that he's away.
So he's like looking back on it, but he says like the saucer was coming. Does he know at that time that it was coming?
He says he does, yeah. Because
Is he like walking outside?
because this and this is where the whole time thing gets a little funky, you know. And again, we're not going to try to convince us that time does exist or does not exist. What can Tralfamadorians do that humans can't? They can see not in 3 dimensions, but in 4, and that 4th one being time. So, we're waiting for that.
Based on
So-
like Friday.
Billy has embraced this viewpoint, so he knows that they are going to come, because they always do come to pick him up on that date in 1968, you know, right before his daughter is going to get married. So that moment's always going to happen, because it always has happened and it always will happen. So from the Tralfamadorian viewpoint, and when they look at the universe, what do they see? Or I should put it the other way. What do we see if we look up at the night sky? You know, we see all the stars. I wasn't going to do Little Dipper and Big Dipper or any of that kind of stuff. But for the Tralfamadorians, when they take a look at it, they don't see stars and points, but they basically see a plate of spaghetti, because they see the movement of all the stars, where the stars have been, where they're going, and all that kind of stuff. So we take a look at a fixed point, something that's 200 million light years away. We're looking at it from 200 million years ago. They take a look at it and they see all those things. And so when they look at humans, remember, we look like little centipedes to them. At one end are our little chubby baby legs. At the other end are our old varicose vein legs. And then in the middle is everything else. Why is death not a big deal? Because it's always happened, it always will happen, but they can choose to look at whatever moment they want to. So if you have had a bad experience, the so it goes idea would come in, because I don't have to worry about that physics test, or I don't have to worry about that Invisible Man TWA. I can go back to this moment in Disney, or this moment in summer vacation, or this moment in period 7, which will put a smile on my face. Not for me, but for someone. And you can listen to that and go, that actually sounds pretty good. So it goes. I don't have to worry about it. Those eyebrows are not happening. Or you could look at it as to, that sounds good, but are you really trying to avoid a whole bunch of problems and dilemmas and conflicts that way, and is that really good for you? That's where things kind of become a little bit tougher. But the overall setup of the book, basically Slaughterhouse-5 would pretty much mimic this idea. Any thoughts as to whether or not you liked So It Goes? Like, are you going to get the So It Goes t-shirt and graphics and basically wear it every day? And
I just got my Air Jane shirt.
that's not So It Goes.
I don't know. I mean, it sounds good.
I don't mean like who's the first person to say the phrase, but essentially whose idea is it so far as So It Goes? It's the Trout from the Dorian viewpoint. Now, who has certainly embraced this idea? It would seem that Billy has, because Billy doesn't seem to care a whole lot about anything. So a Trout from the Dorian point of view, but one that certainly seems to be embraced by Billy. Again, I don't think that necessarily means that it was embraced by Kurt Vonnegut. Byron made the comment, it doesn't really seem like an anti-war book. If it's an anti-war book, you would think So It Goes would be the furthest thing that he would want to get people's attention with, because you'd be saying people died in war. Oh well, so it goes. Read my book, it'll make you not want to have war happen anymore. What's Billy do for a profession? Optometrist. What do they do? Help people see. So for Billy, what's he providing to people who will actually listen to him? A new way of looking at things and seeing things. So it's an appropriate business, it's an appropriate career for Billy, where he's basically prescribing a new vision for, Earthlings. Personally, I would say Vonnegut does not agree with it at all. Any idea why? Like, I think you would be a misreading to go, Vonnegut wants me to go So It Goes and not care about anything. But I think he wants the exact opposite, where he wants you to care about things. At least not in a overt, blatant, obvious kind of way, no. Chapter 1, Mary O'Hare already mentioned this. What's the promise? Children's Crusade. Why would this be an appropriate title, whether you're looking at it from Mary O'Hare's viewpoint or anybody else? You remember how old Roland/Ronald is? Yeah, I mean, Roland is only, probably make you feel better, only an 18-year-old kid who smells like bacon and has a lot of knives and, torture devices. But he is still he's still a child. Certainly his viewpoint of things would be naive, at least as to how war would be. But, World War II, it's essentially, in their minds, fought by babies. The last thing that Mary O'Hare wants is for the book to be turned into a Hollywood movie. And she mentions Frank Sinatra and John Wayne. For our purposes, it would be, George Clooney, Matt Damon.
Barack
Mark Wahlberg.
Dwayne Johnson.
He's my favorite person.
So if we had Clooney, Damon, and Wahlberg in a war movie,
Yes.
you're watching.
Yeah.
Wait. Don't forget Bradley Cooper.
And
American Sniper, come on.
She wants nothing of that to happen. Can you picture Mark Wahlberg playing Billy Pilgrim?
I can picture him in any role. He's just so versatile.
He started a movie involving a talking teddy bear. I'm pretty sure anything's possible.
Billy was born in 1922 in Ilion, New York, the only child of a barber there. He was a funny-looking child who became a funny-looking youth, tall and weak and shaped like a bottle of Coca-Cola. That is the star of your movie.
Yeah, that's true. Can
No
you
more
stand up and do a
Wahlberg.
little spin for us?
No, George.
Wow.
He graduated in the upper third class.
So, in some ways, the book becomes so disjointed, so crazy, so idiotic that in a way it can't become that big Hollywood movie.
It does become a movie in 1972. But it can't become a movie that all the stars are going to be lining up for because they certainly wouldn't kind of fit in the part. At the end of part one, or chapter one, after you have the Mary O'Hare thing and all that kind of stuff, Vonnegut then gets into this reference to Lot. And he's making a pretty direct biblical allusion that would take place. He doesn't give you a whole lot of detail about the story of Lot, but you're going back to Old Testament. Anyone familiar with Lot and his wife?
Sounds familiar.
With big lots?
No.
I was facing the other way.
Lot was going to get out of the city and not look back, and so like he gets his family and they run, but his wife looks back and starts to kill herself.
You have the two cities of Sodom and Gomorrah who are filled with sinners, and so their punishment essentially is they are going to be consumed by fire. Now, not that you have a direct same thing happening with Dresden, because certainly we look at the people in Dresden as being victims, but you have a book about a city consumed in fire with Dresden, Germany, and he kind of starts off with this allusion to two cities being consumed with fire with Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot and his family are allowed to escape. Angels basically come down and lead them out, and hey, you will be fine, you will escape all the travesty that's going to happen, but you cannot look back. Lot's wife does look back, and the punishment for her is she becomes a pillar of salt. And so basically like a statue. So on page 22, you then get, that line followed up by Vonnegut, and I loved her for that. And that is one reason why this book is a failure, because it is written by a pillar of salt. Which, what does that therefore insinuate? What is he doing with the book? He is looking back. And he has to look back. Because to look back is the what thing to do?
Wrong.
It's not the wrong.
The instinct. Instinct. Human.
It's the human thing to do. So to not look back, to not look at situations, to not relive them is to basically not be human. Am I okay? Okay. So if to do so it goes, if a person dies or anything happens and you just go so it goes, you don't think about it, you don't look back, you just kind of continue to live on. But Vonnegut is writing a book where, in his own way, it's not the normal way, but what's he doing with Dresden? He's looking back. It might not be in the way that we would expect him to, but it's his human element of how he would go about doing it. Whereas Vonnegut would not have anything to do, or excuse me, not Vonnegut, Billy would not have anything to do with that because he has totally become absorbed in embracing this Tralfamadorian viewpoint. So where it becomes an anti-war book, and I think we would probably be guilty of this as well with conflicts. We don't always necessarily value the loss of life that takes place. We don't necessarily try to think of ways that we can end war. You have the Harrison Starr movie producer. Hey, if you're going to have an anti-war book, you may as well write an anti-glacier book because they're going to happen no matter what. That kind of becomes a common thought about us. One thing that you could argue that does happen with So It Goes, some would say it might trivialize, the deaths that take place. At other points, though, it does at least identify when you have an end of life and calls attention to it. So the downside would be you're taking a victim from Dresden and you're basically paralleling it with a flat bottle of champagne. On the other side, though, you're not going and people died and then move on to something else. You do at least pause, stop, so it goes, acknowledge it, and then kind of continue on with some things. So I would say it still fits that anti-war book, Children's Crusade, written by a pillar of salt, but it certainly doesn't do it in a typical way. Tomorrow we can take a look at Who to Eat, because that's how the book ends, and a whole bunch of you turn the page to the last page to see, does the book really end that way? And you discover that it did. As well as some other things that will come up. We can talk about Roland, we can kind of get into the other characters as well, and try to make some sense out of it.